Hello grade 8s, this is Mr. Miller and welcome to lesson 8.4 on dividing integers. So we're going to be looking at some division statements for each of these diagrams, and the diagrams this time are number lines. So I've got a little key off to the side here, and my apologies that it's sideways, but it's the only way I could sort of fit it into the handout here. But the dividend is the total value of the arrow. That's the thing that we're dividing up. And that's going to be highlighted in yellow, you'll notice as we go through the examples. The divisor, which can be one of two things. It can be the number of segments that we're dividing this into, or it can be the size of each segment. So depending on that, it's going to be highlighted either blue or green. Now the quotient, which is the answer to the division question, is going to be either the size of each segment or it's going to be the number of segments. So it's going to be highlighted differently depending on the situation, how it's been interpreted. So looking at the first example here, here is the division statement that we could say that this diagram represents. So it could be positive 12 as the dividend, that's the total value of the arrow, and we're dividing it into 4 segments. And so the answer, the quotient, is the size of each segment, which is positive 3. Positive 3, positive 3, positive 3, positive 3. Now there is another interpretation of this diagram, which is that it could be you are taking the positive 12 and you are dividing it into segments of size positive 3, and so the answer, the quotient, is the number of segments that divides it into. So if you understood that, maybe you want to try the next one on your own. Part B, starting with what is the dividend, so total value of the arrow here. Obviously that would be negative 10. So you can do one of two things. You can either divide it into 2 segments and the size of each segment would be negative 5, or you could say that this diagram represents negative 10 that's divided into segments of size negative 5, and that gives you 2 segments. So there are, again, 2 division statements that you could write here. And part C will be doing the same thing. So we start with positive 6 as our dividend, and if you're dividing it into 6 segments, then the size of each segment will be 1. Or you could say that you're taking 6 and you're dividing it into segments of size 1, and so the answer will be the number of segments that you get, which is positive 6. And finally, part D, we've got total value of the arrow is negative 14. So you can divide it into 7 segments, and that'll give you segments of size negative 2 each. Or the other interpretation is if you take negative 14 and divide it into segments of size negative 2, then you'll get 7 segments. So there's an important thing to realize here, and we looked at this in lesson 8.3 as well, which is that the number of segments must be positive. It doesn't make sense to talk about negative 2 segments. You can say segments of size negative 2, but the number of segments must be positive. So for that reason, this model starts to break down a little bit when you try to take a look at a positive divided by a negative. Because a positive divided by a negative is going to be a negative, and so both the number of segments and the size of each segment would need to be negative, but of course the number of segments is supposed to be positive. So you can only do a positive divided by a positive, as we did here, a negative divided by a positive or a negative divided by a negative, you notice that in all of these examples you never see a positive divided by a negative. That can't be modeled with the number line. Alright, the next thing we want to look at here in number 2 is to tell whether the resultant quotient is positive or negative. So this is based on the rules that we know. So we know that when we have a negative number divided by a positive number, the answer should be a negative number. A positive number divided by a positive number, of course, should give us a positive number. A negative divided by a negative should give us a positive. And a positive divided by a negative, although we weren't able to model that with our number line, we've seen this before, and it is a negative number. Notice that the rules here are the same as for multiplication. So when you have a positive divided by a positive or a negative divided by a negative, in other words, when the sign is the same for the dividend and the divisor, the answer to the division question or the quotient will be positive. When you have opposite signs between your dividend and your divisor, either negative and positive, positive and negative, the answer to the division question or the quotient will be negative. So based on that, we should be able to answer these questions in number 3 without too much difficulty, without having to draw any number lines or anything like that. We can just use our rules. First of all, a positive divided by a negative is going to be a negative, and 56 divided by 7 will give you 8. In part B, a negative divided by a negative is going to be a positive, and 45 divided by 15 is going to give you 3. Negative 36 divided by positive 12, a negative divided by a positive is going to be a negative, and 36 divided by 12 is 3. 60 divided by 10, both positive, answer will be positive, and it's positive 6. Next thing we want to take a look at here in number 4 is to divide the dividend negative 8 by as many different integers as possible. And each quotient must be an integer. We want to list all the possible division statements. So as you can see, I'm claiming there's going to be 8 possibilities. Let's take a look at each one. So negative 8 can be divided by negative 8. Of course, that should give you positive 1. You can divide it by positive 8 as well. That will give you negative 1. You can divide it by positive 2. That will give you negative 4. Or you can divide it by negative 2. That will give you positive 4. Negative 8 can also be divided by positive 4. That will give you negative 2. Or divided by negative 4, that'll give you positive 2. And finally, negative 8 can be divided either by positive or negative 1. In each case, you'll get either negative 8 or positive 8. So that lists all the possible division statements that you can have. Okay, and last example to look at here, number 5. For each of the following questions, there are 2 different pairs of integers that will work. We want to know which 2 integers have a product of positive 20 and a quotient of positive 5. So, here's one possibility. 10 times 2 is 20, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. The other possibility is to do negative 10 times negative 2, that's also positive 20. And notice that negative 10 divided by negative 2 is also positive 5. So there are your 2 answers. Next, which 2 integers have a product of negative 18 and a quotient of negative 2? So positive 6 times negative 3 will give you negative 18. And positive 6 divided by negative 3 will give you negative 2. If we switch the signs around, this gives us a different answer. So negative 6 times positive 3 will give you negative 18, and negative 6 times negative 6 divided by positive 3 is negative 2. So there are your 2 possible answers. And finally, which 2 integers have a product of 4 and a quotient of 4? So 4 times 1 is 4, 4 divided by 1 is also 4. Negative 4 times negative 1 is 4. And negative 4 divided by negative 1 is also positive 4. So that completes the lesson on dividing integers. Hope that you understood this. If you have any questions, please ask in class, and we'll see you then.